Thank you, Malcolm. Good morning. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Desert. I'm Joni Padduck, and I'm going to be your worship associate this morning. I am very pleased to be working with my friend, Corbett Bratten. Corbett's a longtime friend of UUCOD. Some of you know him, but some may not, so let me tell you a little bit about Corbett. Corbett has a BA in telecommunications from Michigan State University and is a retired broadcast journalist, news, and sportscaster. Wait till you hear his voice. He enjoys singing and has performed with the California Desert Chorale and the Sandblasters Chorus, which is a barbershop harmony society. He's an award-winning actor in the Coachella Valley and has performed with several theater companies, including several plays in this very space with script to stage to screen. He has been on the board of directors of Veterans for Peace for 12 years. And Veterans for Peace, a part of their statement of purpose is speak quite well to our 8th principle, which is to resist racism and repression. That comes from their statement of purpose. Corbett is also an ethical vegan and animal rights activist. So welcome, Corbett. You'll be hearing from him in just a little while. As we begin our service, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the historic homelands of the various bands of Cahuilla people, and we honor the unique relationship that we hope emerges between our community and the indigenous people and their traditional territories. Let this acknowledgement serve as a reminder to recognize, honor, reconcile, and partner with the Cahuilla people whose lands and water we benefit from today. It's important to us here in this community to create a safe and healthy environment for everyone who gathers in worship, including those who are immunocompromised or have other risk factors. Our COVID protocols about vaccination and mask use are in place because we wish to do everything we can to protect all of us. A reminder that masks covering your nose and mouth are required to attend in-person worship, preferably a KN95 mask. If you arrived without a mask, we have some available at the welcome desk, and I'm sure our ushers took care of that as you came in. Please choose to act for the health and safety of our community. Our service is always available streamed on our website if you need to observe from home. We also want you to know that it doesn't matter where you or your ancestors are from, who you love, your gender identity, your theology, your politics, or your immigration status. All are welcome who are committed to our core values as expressed in our 8 principles. Together we come to this place to share our hopes, dreams, and visions. We seek to build a diverse and inclusive community that honors our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every being. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, whether here in the sanctuary or on our website streaming service. Please consider making a donation with our virtual offering basket. Your contribution is an important way to support and sustain UUCOD. Those of you watching online can just click on the link provided in our weekly constant contact order of worship received on Friday, or through the email link that you'll receive this morning. If you're here in the room, we'll be taking up a collection in just a little bit. And if you would like to be on our email list to learn more about us and our programming, please contact us by email at admin@uucod.org. And now we will ring our Tibetan bowl to begin our service and listen to our music for centering. As we gather this morning to worship together, with peace being our central theme today, I'd like to share this quote from Thomas Merton, who was a passionate advocate for nonviolence and a critic of the American government during the race riots and the Vietnam War protests. Quote, "Peace demands the most heroic labor and the most difficult sacrifice. It demands greater heroism than war. It demands greater fidelity to the truth and a much more perfect purity of conscience. Let us worship together and take our work for peace into the world." And now, if you will stand as you're willing and able and join in our opening hymn, number 159, "This Is My Song," and the words will be up on the screen. Sounding good this morning. And now I'd like to ask Catherine Pete to come up and to light our chalice, and if you could read along with me, the words are up on the screen. "To face the world's shadows, a chalice of light. To face the world's coldness, a chalice of warmth. To face the world's terrors, a chalice of courage. To face the world's turmoil, a chalice of peace. May its glow fill our spirits, our hearts, and our lives." Thank you, Catherine. And Mac will light our BioPOC candle this morning. And if you could, as he lights it, read along with me. "We light these candles in solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and other people of color as they journey towards spiritual wholeness. May we, as a beloved community, work to dismantle racism and all forms of oppression. May we live out our principles so that justice, dignity, and equity for all prevail." Thank you, Mac. And now our hymn for meditation, "Spirit of Life" and Puente de Amor. Okay, so thank goodness for Google, because as I was sitting there, I realized I left my reading at home. But I was able to Google it. So now the trick will be if these old eyes can really read a little screen like this. The title is Equality in a Sea of Inequality by Peggy Clark. When this country was founded, the aspiration was high. The men who imagined it dreamed big, casting a vision of a world where all men were created equal, where rights were endowed by our Creator, transcending culture and the expectations of the day, where life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness would be allowed and enjoyed without infringement. It was a radical and new vision born from Enlightenment optimism inspired by scientists' discoveries. It was an intoxicating vision, as bold as the Protestant Reformation that swept all of Europe. And they had the hubris to believe they could make it happen. They staked their claim in the Declaration of Independence and institutionalized it in the Constitution. They elected their first president when he stepped down, relinquishing power to the return to the role of citizen. Those founders believed they lived to see their vision realized. A new president ran for office, and the republic was up and running. It was done. A new world order. Those men weren't distracted by the genocide they inspired or the enslavement of other people they required for this nation to be born. They declared equality while swimming in a sea of inequality. They weren't including, black people who had been enslaved or those who were free. They didn't include Catholics, Jews, or people who didn't own land. They were so proud of their inclusivity, so inspired by their own cutting-edge philosophy, that they had no idea how narrow it was, how constrictive, how small a vision. The men who wrote these words were calling into being a more perfect union. They were establishing justice, ensuring domestic tranquility, securing the blessings of liberty. They believed, that they and the men of their generation would will this new nation into being. They would establish the structures required for such a grand vision. They would test it, and test it would be done. They didn't realize it would require many more people, many different voices. They didn't know how many generations would have to be a part of the creation of that dream, how long it would take before the nation they imagined would be made manifest. The soul of America has yet to be born. Now, if I could ask the ushers to come forward to take the offering this morning.
We are so grateful for your generosity today and every day, the money you share, the time you spend, the love you give to keep this community and its work in the world thriving and being meaningful. Thank you. These are the joys and sorrows of this community. We light a candle of celebration. Joni lights a candle of celebration on the birth of her stepdaughter Brittany's first child, Isla, to her and her husband, Tariq. Congratulations. The Pete Paduano family lights a candle to say thank you to everyone at the congregation and at De Benneville Pines Camp for supporting the kids and allowing them to have a fun summer camp experience up at Big Bear. We hope you have a great time there. It's such a beautiful place. I want to take some time to share a couple of the joys and sorrows that were shared last week because we had some sound issues and our streaming folks didn't hear them. Wanted to share a candle of gratitude from Rabbi Jules, who preached here last week. He is asking for our thoughts that he continues to heal well from his minor surgery. Sandra and Margaret share that they were so blessed to be able to share in the 10-year renewal of vows of Margaret's son Andrew and wife Christine. It was a lovely ceremony held at the San Juan Bautista Mission. As a special treat, it was on their anniversary date too. And a candle from Chris Eager to share joyful hope and gratitude for his wife Denise's gradual recovery from long, hard COVID and a torn rotator cuff. She was able to share his joy from working in the garden this week, and he is so glad for her and hope her recovery continues. There are joys and sorrows that remain in the quiets of our hearts, and we honor those as well today. Will you join me, my friends, in a time of prayer and contemplation? Because, my friends, this feels like time when so much we value, so much we have been fighting for, our very rights feel under attack, under siege from the forces of fear and hatred and cruelty. A time when the choices we have made as a nation, as a society, bear fruit in violence and disenfranchisement and hopelessness. In this time we choose to gather in the presence of our neighbors and our kin just met and long loved. Will you take a deep breath with me? As we gather together, we remind each other and ourselves that we are not alone, that we are connected, that we share the breath of life with all around us, that we are called to humbly act in the world for justice and for kindness. Take a breath with me. By our breathing, we remind each other that we are not alone and we are not resourceless in this work. We know the ways of love when we listen. We know the ways of peace when we pay attention. We know the ways of justice and connection when we reach out. And so we gather also in a time where we see justice growing in the hearts of those pushing back against those forces of injustice, love pushing back against those forces of fear, and peace pushing back against those forces of violence. There is hope. So we take a breath together. By the sound and the feel of that breath, we know that we are surrounded and strengthened, inspired and held by the Spirit of life, the fire of love, the fierce and gentle Spirit that lives in and through us. Here in this space, made holy by our intentional gathering, we pause for a time of quiet. Hear the beating of our hearts and the hearts around us, to feel the presence of loved ones, and to rest for a time in the embrace of peace, and connection, and love. We breathe in quiet together. May all beings know peace. May all beings know an end to suffering. May all beings know love. May it be so. Now it is my great pleasure to invite Corbett up into the pulpit to speak with us this morning.
Thank you, Reverend Ian and Joni. Good morning, everyone. The substance of my talk today is derived primarily from a master's thesis by Portland State University student Laura K. Wagner, a study of veterans and the peace movement. I've edited and reworded it to hopefully make it suitable for this oral presentation. What is it that leads one veteran to leave military service and then internalize ideologies like those of peace movements, while another veteran holds on to ideologies of patriotism that are based on the honor of war and military action? Throughout the history of the United States, there have been service members who, upon leaving active duty, have spoken out against U.S. involvement in subsequent wars. However, it is only recently that some veterans have begun to shift from an idea of patriotism, equated with honorable military service, to one that also includes the possibility of participation in efforts for peace and conflict resolution without violence or military intervention. The Vietnam War triggered protests and polarized civilian citizens of the U.S. Veterans of that war and the wars that followed were no exception. Many veterans have come forward to speak out against the more recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and have also self-identified as members of peace movements. What is particularly interesting is the increase in the number of veterans in anti-war and pro-peace organizations. Peace movements are defined as efforts based on beliefs centered around prevention, de-escalation, and conflict resolution via non-violent means such as demonstrations, boycotts, lobbying, or diplomacy. A deeper understanding of the meaning of peace movement for veterans might also aid in awareness about the range of understanding and emotional commitment, as well as the types and extents of involvement available to veterans in peace movements. Now, a bit of historical background of the United States peace movements. In 1812, the United States was still a newly formed nation on the brink of war with what was, at the time, the reigning empire. The new nation had been pulled into conflict between France and England against its will. Many saw this as a war of conquest, and they cited the U.S. government's desire to annex Canada for the United States. There followed protests and statewide militias refusing to serve, even while others were drawn into the fight. As the war dragged on, the U.S. began to suffer some serious land-based losses. Support for the war became scarcer, and the anti-war movement pressed forward. Volunteers to fight dwindled. However, for many, opposition to the war was seen as treasonous and unpatriotic. As was famously stated, "He who is not for us is against us." While there is little direct connection between the protest efforts of the War of 1812 and later anti-war movements, those movements that came later can trace their roots to this first movement. Several peace societies formed and died afterward, and others continued to form as the nation grew and became involved in more wars. In 1849, William Jay wrote in A Review of the Causes and Consequences of the Mexican War, quote, "We have been taught to ring our bells and illuminate our windows and let off fireworks as manifestations of our joy. when we have heard of great ruin, devastation, and misery and death inflicted by our troops upon a people who never injured us, who never fired a shot on our soil, and who were utterly incapable of acting on the offensive against us." End quote. Abraham Lincoln, at that time a congressman, spoke out against the war, as he believed, and rightly so, that the conflict had been set up. As before, protesting was seen as unpatriotic. For example, Henry David Thoreau was jailed due to his protests. Protests began in earnest again with the coming of the Civil War. The basis of the movement was not so different from those stated today: the cost, benefit, efficiency, the horrors of war that veterans and their families face, and the disgrace of war for profit. The Civil War brought forth for the first time in the nation's history government suspension of people's legal rights, censorship of the media, jailing of editors who spoke out, citizens arrested and jailed with no trial, and the use of troops to break up strikes and protests. The Spanish-American War brought the U.S. into international politics in a way it had not previously been, that lasted into the 20th century. However, here again, many Americans were concerned over the colonialistic nature of the Spanish-American War and spoke out against the U.S. becoming another imperialist power. Mark Twain and many others, including veterans from the Civil War, spoke out because they believed that the U.S. went to war not for the noble cause of freeing the people under Spain, but rather to expand its territories and its control. World War I introduced a new wave of anti-war and peace movements. In June of 1918, political activist and trade unionist Eugene Debs stated, quote, "And here let me emphasize the fact, and it cannot be repeated too often, that the working class who fight all the battles, the working class who make the supreme sacrifices, the working class who freely shed their blood and furnish the corpses, have never yet had a voice in either declaring war or making peace. It is the ruling class that invariably does both. They alone declare war, and they alone make peace." However, by and large, these protest efforts were post-war, and as a result, this is a time when the peace movement began to really focus on the corporate interests of war, maintaining of the status quo at the cost of young lives, and drafts that targeted the poor but gave them no voice in decisions regarding military action. It is also during this time that the peace movement began to see another surge of veteran involvement. Similar to what occurred at the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, veterans from the Civil War once again spoke out against U.S. involvement in the war. As before, opposition to the war was seen as unpatriotic. People who spoke out against the war found themselves arrested and sentenced to long prison terms due to the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which specifically led to a 10-year prison sentence for the previously quoted Eugene Debs. World War II introduced a new generation of protesters and the final step in producing a movement with a focus of shared common goals. However, the war resistance was almost entirely focused to the beginning of the war and faded to a few dedicated pacifists as it progressed. Peace movement efforts picked up again as the Cold War began, as nuclear armament became more and more prolific, and more young men and women were put into harm's way. During this time, protesters were seen with suspicion and might find themselves labeled a communist or under government surveillance. The Cold War boosted the power and position of the military-industrial complex, and the policy-making ideals that came from this time have come to dominate even into today. When one considers the peace movement, Vietnam-era protests are the most likely to come to mind. This movement began in the early 1960s, although opposition to any involvement in Vietnam had been brewing since the 1950s, when the U.S. stepped in after the French left. Media coverage of anti-war street protests and the shooting at Kent State both served to make the movement more available and real to the public at large and cemented the resolve of protesters. At the same time, increasing numbers of Vietnam veterans returning from the war began to get involved in the anti-war movement. Many of those involved in the peace movement from the Vietnam era and many veterans who served in that war are now the foundation of today's peace movements. In looking back, it's eerie to see the parallels between the wars and struggles of the past with those of today. What is different today is that there are a variety of peace and anti-war organizations for veterans. For example, Veterans for Peace, VFP, of which I am a member, is an organization comprised of male and female veterans of World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and other conflicts, as well as peacetime veterans. Founded in 1985, Veterans for Peace is in all 50 states and a few other countries and works to promote alternatives to war. The organization has opposed the military policies of the United States, NATO, and Israel, and has opposed military actions and threats to Russia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, Libya, and Syria. There is another peace movement called Iraq Veterans Against the War, and that was formulated and began right after 9/11. Of course, it's not necessary for an individual to affiliate with an organization in order to see him or herself as part of a peace movement. Often, simply identifying with the aims and goals or having an ideology that is similar to a larger organization is enough for an individual to have a feeling of being part of a peace movement. War is a racket. That is the title of a book authored by retired Marine Major General Smedley D. Butler. He writes the war has always been a racket, the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. It's conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. At least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires were made in the United States during World War I. Now, how many of these war millionaires do you believe may have shouldered a rifle? How many of them dug a trench? How many of them knew what it meant to go hungry in a rat-infested dugout? How many of them spent sleepless, frightened nights ducking shells and shrapnel and machine gun bullets? How many of them were wounded or killed? Out of war, nations acquire additional territory if they're victorious. It promptly is exploited by the few, the same few, who wrung dollars out of blood in the war. The general public shoulders the bill. And what is this bill? This bill renders a horrible accounting. Newly placed gravestones, mangled bodies, shattered minds, broken hearts and homes, economic instability, depression and all its attendant miseries, backbreaking taxation for generations and generations. Of course, for these losses, there would be a compensating profit. Fortunes would be made, millions and billions of dollars piled up by a few. Munitions makers, bankers, shipbuilders, manufacturers, meat packers, speculators, they would fare well. So they are always getting ready for another war. Why shouldn't they? It pays high dividends. But what does it profit the masses? What does it profit the men and women who are killed or maimed? What does it profit their families? What does it profit anyone except the very few to whom war means huge profits? It would be far cheaper, not to mention safer, for the average American who pays the bills to stay out of foreign entanglements For a very few, this racket, like bootlegging and other underworld rackets, brings fancy profits, but the cost of operations is always transferred to the people who do not profit. Now, Veterans for Peace is also involved in present day against other positive, progressive movements, and not just against combat and military wars. Our headquarters of Veterans for Peace sent out a letter just a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I'd like to read it to you to give you an idea of the progressive ideas other than just war and combat that Veterans for Peace are working for. Veterans for Peace was organized by military veterans and allies to bring an end to all war and the oppressive systems that enable it. VFP believes that everyone has the absolute right to control their bodies, including reproductive functions, and have access to adequate health care. The Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade constitutes a war on rights of bodily autonomy and self-determination, and as such, VFP has a responsibility to fight against it. Present and historical discourse centers the overturning of Roe v. Wade as a women's-only issue and within the gender binary. VFP recognizes the rights guaranteed under Roe v. Wade has had a wider impact on the bodily autonomy of all gender identities, and the present ruling is part of a larger push to reassert heteropatriarchal control over the population. This cannot be tolerated. This and other recent Supreme Court decisions are an exertion of white supremacist, patriarchal, and theological power and control, and not about the preservation of life. The Supreme Court's decision in siding with white supremacy will most negatively affect the same populations who have been most impacted by previously existing restrictions on reproductive health care. People of color, who have the highest childbirth mortality rates in the United States, youth, particularly trans and non-binary, indigenous populations, and those in poverty. These rights have historically been ignored by the United States government and its military through the forced sterilization of the occupied sovereign population of Puerto Rico, in addition to many other Black, brown, indigenous, and differently abled populations. It is a hypocritical policy to force birth under the guise of preserving life, while the active foreign and domestic policies of the government result in the #1 cause of birth defects and stillbirths in places where U.S. military weapons or assets are deployed. From environmental contamination to known abortifacients like Agent Orange and depleted uranium munitions, to over-the-horizon bombings of civilian communities, it is clear the U.S. government is not in the business of preserving life. The health implications of the ruling are far-reaching. It affects the ability to choose to give birth or not, and has the potential to increase domestic violence and decrease access to necessary health care. The attack on and inevitable closing of abortion clinics is dangerous and life-threatening, as they are often the sole source for contraceptive, gender-affirming, and reproductive health care in many communities. In particular, this limits health care operations and options for young people who are subjected to sexual assault and incest, whose health care is frequently under the control of their abusers. Electoral politics, though important, is only one way to support the fight for human rights. It is critical to engage in other forms of organizing and resistance, particularly direct action, strikes, and mutual aid. Veterans for Peace encourages its members to support the community-led movements already rooted in and at the forefront of this issue. Veterans for Peace will aid, abet, and assist our membership and staff and others impacted by these attacks in getting access to reproductive health care. It is imperative to ensure that Veterans for Peace will mobilize its members into systemic community-led resources for the care we need so we can continue to fight for peace at home and peace abroad. That was the letter from VFP headquarters that came out after the recent Roe v. Wade decision. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, you do not have to be a military veteran to be part of a peace movement. As Joni mentioned, I'm an ethical vegan, and one thing that vegans think of daily when we sit down for a meal is peace on my plate. So I can feel every time I sit down to a meal and I look at my plate, there was no animals abused, tortured, or slaughtered in order for me to have a meal. So, since I have a captive audience, I'd like to offer a suggestion or a challenge to you to consider veganism. And I'd like to do that by reciting for you a short poem. I wish I could take credit for writing this poem, but I can't. It was written by a man named Charlie Feist. And it's titled very simply, Vegan Poem. We are living in an age of condemnation in this nation about what to do over those that cannot talk. I once was blind to all that pain, so I couldn't feel the shame in that broken piece of body on my fork. And then I wondered, could any child breed a bird that can't be wild to eat its wings, take off its legs and its head? No. So we pay for hidden slaughter. So we've addicted sons and daughters to our habit of eating the dead. And it's not so very long since who could see the wrong in breeding humans as slaves without paying? Could be a woman without a vote or killing a leopard for its coat. Did we ever see the evil of the day? So do you think you're any better now the animals we fetter outnumber every human 10 to 1? And many children hardly eat because their food is fed your meat. Well, the blame for the shame you pass on. So give me avocados. I'll eat tofu burgers. You can even give me black bean curd. But please, don't give me bread. If it's wrapping the dead, the remains of the body of a bird, for every piece of flesh you buy, you are paying to breed the next to die. My compassion I no longer lend. And for the cow, it's worse, I fear. They rod, rape her every year, take every calf, take all her milk until she's dead. This choice, you say, is your right. You can eat just as you like, and it's merely an opinion that I voice. But your choice kills so many. This opinion kills not any. And your victims, you give them any choice? So there's more to avocados and eating tofu burgers and minimizing sickness, which it does, and your girth. No less than Einstein did resolve, from eating flesh we must evolve, or mankind, he said, may not survive on earth. The age in which we are living is ever more misgiving over what to do for those who cannot talk. Are you blind to all their pain? Can you not feel the shame in that broken piece of body on your fork? Just something to think about. Finally, glad you heard, and happy to hear me say finally, right? One last suggestion or challenge, however you wish to take it. UUCOD is a member of Unitarian Universalist Association, which has several principles which you affirm and promote, I believe 8 of them. The very first one is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. I would like to challenge you or suggest to your association to talk to the higher-ups and consider possibly just adding 3 words to your first principle. So that it would go, the inherent worth and dignity of every person and sentient being. Thank you for your time and your attention. Have a wonderful day and stay safe.
Thank you, Corbett, for those challenging and fascinating, interesting words and some deep learning for all of us. Thank you. We're going to sing together as we come to the end of our service. We're going to sing number 121, We'll Build the Land. The words will be on the screen. I invite you to rise in body and spirit as we hear Corbett's, as we hear Corbett's words and take in the challenges that he brings to us. We think about what kind of world, what kind of nation, kind of hearts we want to create together. And so we're going to sing about that a little bit. So please rise in body and spirit as we sing number 121, We'll Build a Land. Want to confess to you who programmed the audiovisual elements of the service this week. That was me. So my apologies for that little glitch. I wanted to so. Friends, it has been wonderful to gather together today. I wanted to be here not to sort of invade Joni and Corbett's service, but because I haven't been in the pulpit in a little while and I wanted to be with you today. And so I want to share that we are grateful, Corbett, for your words and your witness and for your call to be better stewards and creators of peace and life. Thank you for that. I want to close and thank you, Joni, for today's service, and Malcolm, and our AV folk, and all of you. I want to close today with the words of my colleague, the Reverend Jim McGaw. When I say go in peace, right, I don't mean go in mindless oblivion. When I say go in peace, I don't mean go without challenging yourselves or others. When I say go in peace, I don't mean go in utter ease and comfort. When I say go in peace, I mean go in peace seeking justice. I mean go in peace committed to equal rights and opportunities for all. When I say go in peace, he writes, I mean go in the peace that is created when together we build communities of true solidarity, deep compassion, and fierce, unrelenting love. And so, my friends, I say to you with those words in your heart, go in peace, my friends, to love and serve the world.